Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Gold Silver Bitcoin Show brought to you by GoldSilverBitcoin.com. We are more than honored to be sitting down today with Stephan Livera, a very well-known Bitcoin podcaster and also the managing director of Swan Bitcoin International. Thank you so much, Stephan, for joining us today.
Thanks for inviting me, Justin.
Well, the year's coming to a close and Bitcoin yet again had another big year. I think that there's probably a bunch of stuff that I'm forgetting. A couple of things that pop out to me is the El Salvador law. Before that, there was Bitcoin 2021, which was something else. There was like 12,000 people. I don't know if that's an accurate number, but it was a lot of people. It was like more like a festival, like a big festival I had been to than any Bitcoin or blockchain conference I'd been to. And then before that, MicroStrategy, I'm sure, bought a couple hundred Bitcoin or something like that at the beginning of the year. PayPal, didn't they just start buying and selling Bitcoin in a very easy interface? What are some of the other stories that you've been keeping an eye on as it relates to Bitcoin as 2021 comes to a close?
Yeah, so as you said, I think you hit some of the key ones there. I think in terms of mainstream awareness, adoption, this whole idea that an entire country, albeit, and that now they might say, okay, it's a small country, El Salvador, but nevertheless, a country having Bitcoin as the legal tender, which is, I mean, it's incredible. When I was getting started in Bitcoin in 2013, could I have foreseen that it would happen this soon? I don't know. I don't think I could have. In terms of big stories, we've seen advancements in technology. Obviously, Taproot, the soft fork in Bitcoin, was activated this year. So that was also a great step forward in terms of being able to move the ball forward on Bitcoin technology. Now, that's one aspect of Bitcoin technology. Of course, there are other elements of that, things like CoinJoin being more accessible for people. So, for example, people can use Sparrow Wallet as an example, or even making multi-sig and self-custody easy with software like Spectre Desktop. So some of these are just open source software application improvements that are making it easier for us as Bitcoin hodlers and users to hold and self-custody our coins and to coin join and to spend privately and various things like this. And of course, as you mentioned, the MicroStrategy's continual buying of Bitcoin and essentially open sourcing the playbook for other companies to follow in their footsteps also. So I think those are probably some of the big key stories this year that I can think of.
At what point do we consider MicroStrategy like a hedge fund, a Bitcoin hedge fund? But I wanted to dig a little deeper into what is Bitcoin Taproot. So it was a soft fork of the Bitcoin blockchain that enhanced Bitcoin scripts to enhance privacy. Bitcoin script is the coding language that Satoshi Nakamoto developed. It's not Turing complete like Solidity. The Taproot enhanced privacy and improved other factors related to complex transactions. And Taproot allowed users to use Bitcoin script in various ways to enhance privacy, scalability, and security. And I guess the Taproot upgrade proposal was released first by Bitcoin core developer Greg Maxwell. Can you speak a little bit more about Taproot?
Sure. So it can be quite a complicated technical thing. And so I've actually done various episodes on my show as well, talking about this. So people who are interested, there's an episode with AJ Towns, another episode with Jonas Nick and Tim Ruffing, and also some of the episodes with Christian Decker and Adam Back that would help explain some of this. But let me give just a high-level explanation. So think of it like when you spend in Bitcoin, you're signing that message. Now, this Taproot soft fork, we colloquially call it the Taproot soft fork, but it's actually three components. So there's the use of Schnorr signatures, there is Taproot, and then there's TapScript. And so essentially, the short version of it is that when you are spending in a multi-signature context, it allows us to have more advanced hidden spending pathways. So as an example, you might have a multi-signature where maybe it starts out as a 3 of 5 multi-signature, meaning you need 3 signatures out of 5 to be able to sign that transaction. But you might have some additional hidden condition that's not disclosed out on the blockchain until you spend it. And so that hidden condition could be, for example, in 5 years' time, it backs off down to 2 of 5 required for security or redundancy or for whatever reason you might want to build this in. So that's just an example. So I want to be clear. It doesn't necessarily it's not like changing the world privacy, but it does help in certain ways. It does help in terms of when we are using Bitcoin's Lightning Network also, that when we open a channel on the Lightning Network, that's an on-chain transaction. Now, currently, when you open that channel, it's on-chain, right? It's a 2 of 2 multi-signature. And when you close that channel, you can see you have to actually reveal what is the script and the signature for that. Now, in the Taproot world, it's like this special cryptographic way that they've done it to make it like a smart public key. And so the short way of thinking of that means they can basically, once this technology is adapted, is fully adopted into all these other aspects of Bitcoin, you can, for example, open a Lightning channel. And if we agree on the closing channel transaction, then people don't, an outside observer doesn't necessarily know, see, that was the closing of a Lightning channel. That just looks like a normal single signature spend. So I know I've thrown a lot of ideas out there, but let me just summarize in English for people out there who might not be following along. Essentially, it makes certain forms of multi-signature more private. It makes the Lightning Network more private, and it allows for additional future possibilities that are coming with future soft forks that can combo this along with other elements that might make everything more efficient. So as an example, some future idea might be to have signature cross-input signature aggregation, which would dramatically make the spending much more efficient in terms of how much data is required on the chain. And it might actually have some privacy, it might lead to other privacy techniques being applied also. So I don't want to oversell the benefit of Taproot. It's not like it's going to change the world all straight away. It'll take time for these things to be built out, but it does help.
So I guess long-term, what we're looking at is greater functionality on Bitcoin with some of the technologies that are being built around it or soft forked into Bitcoin, such as Lightning Network, as you mentioned. I know that there's a lot of Lightning there's a lot of Lightning being used in El Salvador. And then furthermore, also, we've got RSK, which has been for a while seeking to develop smart contracting functionality on top of Bitcoin. There's some projects now that are getting highlighted, such as Sovereign. There's also some other interesting developments using RSK technology, such as, I guess, a company called Money on Chain, Dollar on Chain. So like one thing would be it's stable coins on top of RSK. Or then also they have like a leveraged Bitcoin as well, where you can like hold this token essentially, and its price behavior acts as if it were a leveraged Bitcoin. And then I think they have another technology too. And then so there's RSK, and then there's Blockstack, or rather Stacks, formerly Blockstack, on top of which we're seeing the development of Bitcoin-based NFTs. So what's your view of the kind of greater blockchain development course that we've kind of started to head down now, especially as we're seeing some of the fruit from Lightning, RSK, and Stacks?
Right. So I think with the likes of, I can't comment too much on the likes of RSK and Stacks because I haven't really dived into those as deeply. Now, there is some debate in the community about whether they truly are on Bitcoin, or rather it's more accurate to say something like they are merge mined using Bitcoin's security, but they are still, in the case of Stacks, that there is an altcoin. So it's kind of, that's still a contentious point. So I don't really know there. I think with RSK, I think it's a bit more clear that it's kind of like merge mined, and they're trying to just make things like money on chain or other ideas that can operate on top of that. I see it mostly like getting the money right is the most important thing to me. Now, other people might have other ideas about what they want, whether they want the so-called smart contracts or, I mean, to be clear, Bitcoin does have smart contracts. It has time locking. It has multi-signature. It has scripting. It's just not as expressive as, say, the Ethereum style or whatever other stuff is out there. But at the same time, there's also a security reason for that. And I think it's trying to be money. It's not trying to sort of be all things to all people. But that's it. I think with the likes of Lightning Network, I think people are building out for example, a network of payment channels. And obviously I've had a lot of Lightning developers on my show, or Lightning application builders and entrepreneurs on my show also. But I am fundamentally looking for adoption of Bitcoin as money. So more people holding it. And then other aspects I think will be built out on top. So obviously the Lightning network is a payment network, and we might eventually see some other kind of tokenized ideas and things like that. But I guess for me, I'm just not as interested in those. So I don't sort of dive as deeply into those. I'm more interested in the whole sound money story and sound money adoption. And so for me, I'm more interested around things like Bitcoin self-custody, Lightning network. I think, those are the areas that interest me a lot. But I think we will see interesting developments in things like, as an example, we were just talking about El Salvador. They've recently done the announcement to have a Bitcoin city, and that's going to be funded in part by Bitcoin bonds. Those bonds will be traded on Liquid. So it'll be EBB1, as I recall from the announcement by President Bukele and Samson Mao of Blockstream. Now, that is another example where Liquid is, again, it's a side chain of Bitcoin. So it's not Bitcoin, but essentially people are pegging in and pegging out Bitcoin in and out of that side chain. And then inside that side chain, they're able to do other things such as make use of confidential transactions, confidential assets, other technology and techniques that are either not feasible to be done directly on Bitcoin, or maybe the appetite is not there to have them directly inside Bitcoin. So I think those are a few ideas that we might see. I guess I'm optimistic about the case of things like Liquid as well as a side chain, but I guess it's hard to sort of say what is going to be the next big thing coming out from that.
Why is getting the money so right on Bitcoin?
So I think that's so important, because it's like get your money right first, right? It's like get this thing right, because you need that as the bedrock. You need this as the solid, just unbelievably solid foundation that other things can be built up on top of. Whereas I view a lot of what we might call altcoin DeFi or DinoFi, right? Decentralized in name only. Some of these altcoins, essentially, they are trying to sort of build up really high up this fancy, sophisticated things up in the stack, but they don't have the underlying money right first. They're trying to create their own token. And so what happens when you're trying to create your own token, you're trying to create your own money. And then why would you want to hold it? So it all comes back to what makes Bitcoin different and better. And it just comes down to, it is fundamentally, you don't need a reason to hold it. It's money. You need money, reduces your future uncertainty, right? We hold it because, I might break my arm tomorrow and I need to go to the hospital, and I need to pay for that. I need to keep some cash balance available for that. So you don't need a reason to hold it per se. But what happens with a lot of the altcoins is essentially they become like a utility token. And if the only reason you're using it is for this utility, then why you hold it? Why does anyone want to hold it, right? Now, to use an example from my friend John Pratt, he imagine there was like a bank fee token and bank fee coin they had. Would you prepay your bank fees? Would you hold extra bank fee tokens to pay your bank fee? No, you would just spend, you would minimize the amount of time you're holding it and spend it just at the end when you need it, and spend the rest of your time holding Bitcoin. And so these utility tokens fundamentally just, there's not as much of a reason for them to exist, because they essentially are created. It's almost like they've been interposed into the system, when these other systems could well have been companies that just charge an upfront fee. They just say, okay, it's this many sats, just pay us for the fee, instead of this complicated Rube Goldberg machine of like a blockchain with some altcoin that you need to somehow make to be like the gas to make it work, when I just don't see that as being the path forward.
And so when it comes to getting the money on Bitcoin right, the debate around 2014, 2015, the block size debate was really centering on this idea that Bitcoin was supposed to be an electronic peer-to-peer cash. And that's what it was laid out as. Very quickly, however, this concept of digital gold took hold, really. And As I've ruminated on this, I've just had some like shower thoughts, the equivalent of shower thoughts. And when I look at the geopolitical situation today, especially with the money printing going on at the nation state level, and who knows, I mean, there's also the possibility that it happens at an international level with things like the special drawing rights. There's nothing that's holding I guess, certificate or money like that from being inflated and hyperinflated. But with Bitcoin, you have this transparency that there will only ever be 21 million Bitcoins. And I've started to wonder, based on Gresham's law, I believe it is, I think it's Gresham's law, where like you use the worst money, you spend the worst money and hold the better one. So I wonder, like, with there being only 21 million Bitcoins ever and this sort of deflationary, assuming increasing demand over time nature, if people would even spend it anyway. What do you think?
So let me explain a few things. So Gresham's law is, I think the best way to explain it or think of it is when the government sets a price of one thing in terms of another. So Gresham's law is actually more like a specific application of the general principle when the government sets a price of one thing in terms of another. So historically, it's when they set, let's say, the gold to silver ratio out of whack. So as you said, what people were doing in that scenario is if the government had tried to force the price to be a certain thing, but actually wasn't that price, then there's a real black market or real trading going on out there. So you'd rather spend, obviously, the one that is undervalued relative to its, relative to the government fixed price, because you know that the government has mandated all the other merchants of the land to accept silver, let's say, or whatever other coin at this price, even if it's actually worth less. So in that example, you're spending out the bad one because you're holding the good one, as an example, right? So now, in terms of deflation, how do I think about that? And will that cause people not to spend at all? I think the short answer is no. People will still spend, right? We still need clothes, we still need shelter, still need to eat food, we still have living costs. And even in the world of smartphones and laptops and things, you can say, oh, look, if you just wait another 6 months, you'll get an even better laptop. But eventually you need to buy a laptop now because I need one today to do this call, to do my work, to do whatever. So fundamentally, we're moving into a world that is going to be a growth deflationary world. Now, this is explained by Joseph Solano, one of the legendary Austrian economists, and he wrote this, I think in the 80s or the 90s. He wrote a paper called an Austrian Taxonomy of Deflation. And in that essay, he spells out the 4 types. And there's 2 that are essentially good or benign. And then there are 2 that are bad deflation, if you will, or quote unquote bad deflation. And so he spells out this growth deflationary idea that it's benign, right? It's the cost of the things we buy is coming down over time. And that's actually a good thing for us as consumers. And so my view is that we are moving into that kind of a world where basically just in general, prices are coming down for consumable goods, for things that we consume. Now, investment things might be a little bit different, but essentially things, the cost of housing should be coming down. The cost of clothing should be coming down. The cost of computer equipment and microphones and whatever else should all be coming down over time. And so it's just kind of that tendency, because obviously we're holding Bitcoin. We want to hold it for as long as possible, but we also still need to eat to live. So you just have to find that balance.
That's interesting, growth deflation. And we've had Austrian economists on this show, such as Dr. Walter Block, who all have very friendly views of Bitcoin. And of course, the parallels between those who followed Austrian economics and Bitcoin, especially in the early days, was goes without stating, I would say. So there's so much a growth deflationary world. Like, it seems to me that is an alternative that's there for the taking. Maybe some people call this a renaissance, like a second renaissance or a neo renaissance. Yeah. Tell me more about like the possibility of going down, like, we're talking about hyper Bitcoinization. What is hyper Bitcoinization? Tell us like what the possibilities are there.
Yeah, sure. So essentially, just like how, if you can imagine how in sometimes basket case countries around the world, when their currency starts to hyperinflate, what do people do? They dollarize. Bitcoinization is essentially the world going through this process, but just Bitcoinizing. We're going to start seeing, and of course, the worst countries, the more highly inflationary countries, they'll do it first, and some of them might run to the US dollar in the meantime. But longer term, we view this as everyone's going to be running to Sats. Sats is the standard Bitcoin, or for people who don't know, Sats are a fraction of a Bitcoin. You can buy a fraction of a Bitcoin, and one Bitcoin has 100 million Sats. Now, I see it like the world is moving into being priced in Sats. When I go buy a water, it might be 300 Sats or whatever. So, but the idea is that everything is going to get priced into Sats, and people will eventually reach a point where they don't want to receive fiat money. It will essentially be, your money is no good here. Now, we don't know when that happens. That could be 5 years from now. It could be 15 years from now. We don't know. But essentially, the principle there is that people are going towards the hardest money. So as Stephan outlines in his book, Stephan Livera, the book, The Bitcoin Standard. Now, as he outlines there, he shows historically there was this tendency towards the hardest money. And what he means by that is it's harder to make more of this thing than other things. And so humanity just tended to go towards that as the money because that made sense as the most saleable commodity, right? So if we're thinking back to what Carl Menger was teaching on the origins of money back in the 1800s, he wrote about this idea of money being the most saleable commodity. And so our view as Bitcoiners is that Bitcoin is essentially the most saleable commodity. It's the most marketable commodity because it is so strictly scarce. And that is essentially part of this hyper-Bitcoinization thesis that the whole world is going to move into Sats. Obviously, that necessitates the price of Bitcoin rising dramatically. And we can think of it like the purchasing power of Bitcoin is rising dramatically because eventually fiat, people won't want fiat. They will just want to hold Sats.
We could see this bearing out already in El Salvador, where they are already dollarized, I believe in either the first part of this century, the early 2000s. And now they've moved on to Bitcoin. So if that's the trend that we see moving forward here, it could be that people don't want fiat earlier than what otherwise would have been the case, which actually becomes a question for the United States government to consider, for the Federal Reserve to consider. Of course, we know how they will consider that. They won't look at it as like a positive development, even though it very well might be objectively a positive development for the vast majority of humans on Earth. In fact, I'd say like all but a few. And so now it could, whereas in one alternative timeline, historical timeline, you have all these countries as things kind of in the post-COVID world with fewer goods and services available due to the lockdowns, et cetera, and more money. Whereas they alternatively could have run to dollars. Now they might actually run to Bitcoin, which now raises geopolitical questions of, I think, historical nature, a profound nature. And I think it really just kind of gets down to this kind of core idea that everyone can now be their own bank. You said people are trying to create their own tokens, and regardless of if there's a use case for these tokens, people are essentially trying to create their own money and be their own bank. And I think back not too long ago when Bernard von Neuhaus created the Liberty Dollar, and it was essentially a silver coin that had the US dollar stamp on it. And he ran into real legal issues. In fact, even the company that was minting the coinage, which means they were just stamping the money on it, the Sunshine Mint in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, also ran into legal issues. Fast forward 10 years where we have this situation where in the cryptocurrencies, and let's just isolate Bitcoin alone, where there's profound implications about really the sovereignty of the individual moving forward on the planet. No?
Absolutely. My view is that Bitcoin essentially transfers power that used to exist in big governments, bureaucrats, regulators, and transitions it in the favor of individuals and families and communities, because they will be able to actually store their own value. And I think that will have incredible implications for the rest of the world, because it means that governments won't be able to just print. And right now they benefit dramatically from very, very cheap debt. In fact, I read an article about how the I think libertarians should prioritize Bitcoin as the strategy. And part of that reason is because governments are able to push that cost into the future. They are able to use cheap debt. Cheap government debt and bonds have essentially given the government this ability to create this system that benefits itself, right? The government benefits from having very high inflation because it can just keep inflating away the value of its dollar or of its whatever fiat currency it has. And so this is essentially a bulwark. Sound money is like a check against the power of the state. It may not go to zero, but I think it will dramatically downsize, and we will eventually be living in a world where government agencies are much smaller than they are today. And I think they will be forced to be a lot more, how would I say it, a lot more accountable. I think right now there's a lot less accountability of governments because when they screw up, they can just tax more of your money. And if you don't like it, well, they can print up more money and then use that printed money to enforce it on all of us tax cattle.
Yeah, it's very clear. So when you can create your own money, that you're not very accountable. So Henry Hazlitt, who was a New York Times editor and also a free market economist, Austrian economist, wrote that like inflation promotes reckless spending and invariably leads to very totalitarian situations. So now David Waxman, who runs a big agency, I interviewed him at Bitcoin 2021, and he told me, he's like, Bitcoin changes everything because it'll force people to be accountable. And I think what he was getting at is very similar to what Hazlitt argued, was that when you have money that is perceived to be devaluing on a long enough timeline, people might not be they might not save. They don't save. So obviously money printing, it discourages saving. People spend more and they spend more recklessly. Now, libertarians. So I think that not only can libertarians adopt Bitcoin as the monetary strategy, but also at least here in the United States, the conservative movement, critique them as we can, at least they question government. And I believe that there is a real clear overlap between some of their ideas and the ideas of Austrian economists, of libertarians, and ultimately Bitcoiners. And I think this was played out very clearly at Bitcoin 2021. In fact, some of the complaints about it was that people thought that they were like at a Q meetup. And so now I'm not making a qualitative statement about Q by any means. I'm just outlining the feeling that people were getting at this event. Furthermore, Jack Dorsey, although I think widely welcomed, had some detractors at the conference. And so I think that like a hyper Bitcoinization, Bitcoin mass adoption very well like could happen quickly. And so looking at El Salvador now, can you tell us a little bit more about what's happened in El Salvador, the Bitcoin bonds, the volcano mining? That, of course, was announced at Bitcoin 2021. And Jack Mallers, when he was giving the speech, he's the CEO of Strike, the founder of Strike. He highlighted a part of the bill which essentially says central banks are printing money and it's reckless and we're forced to do this. So what's going on in El Salvador as far as Bitcoin is concerned?
Well, I mean, they are moving very quickly at adopting Bitcoin. Now, that said, it's not everyone in the country, and there are obviously some pros and cons going on here. So the Chivo wallet has had some criticism of it. And essentially, what I noticed and what I saw from talking to people was that some of the Lightning payments were not getting recognized. As in, if you made a payment from outside of Chivo with a Lightning wallet, those payments were not always getting recognized by the Chivo wallets. And so that can cause a bit of a teething issue for the merchants. Now, that said, those merchants who are using the private sector solutions, the likes of OpenNode, the likes of Ebex Mercado or Bitcoin Beach, those wallets were all working pretty reliably. Now, that said, it's a journey, and I don't want to be overly criticizing them. They've obviously, they had to do this in 90 days, right? They basically had 90 days announcement to Bitcoin law going live. And so yeah, I think you have to give them a little bit of a slack here. They're the only country doing this. So you have to anticipate there will be some teething issues around Lightning adoption.
I think that would,
Bitcoin use.
I've heard this line, and now as you're saying it, after everything we've talked about here, I think that like that is a Bitcoiners taking a defensive tone for this stuff, and like because I've seen this on Twitter too, the issues with the wallet. I think that it's just we need to be on the offensive. We need to say like, of course, these things are going to run into issues. Like, do you understand the like how massive this implementation is? And barely ever do such massive implementations go off without a hitch. I mean, Facebook was down for was almost an entire day recently. And then California, when they were giving out stimulus money, gave like $2 billion to like, I think people in prison, which apparently wasn't supposed to happen. That's a big failure. So any entrepreneur who's running at scale, like they practically assume they're going to mess up along the way.
Of course, yeah. And so for me, it's more just giving a balanced take, right? It's not for me to just be like, oh, fully Pollyanna, everything's all fine and it's all going to hyper Bitcoinize tomorrow, right? For me, it was more just like I'm giving a balanced take. Like I think here's potentially where things could be done better, but I also recognize, hey, it's a huge thing, and I think it's going to be big because a lot of people will get exposed to holding and using Bitcoin. Now, of course, El Salvador as a country is not a very rich country, so it's going to take some time, and a lot of people might have to get wrecked essentially, right? Like not that I want them to get wrecked. That's the reality. When people first get into Bitcoin, they might try to trade around, and it might be a bit more of a trading between Bitcoin and the US dollar and people playing these games until they realize, no, I need to be holding in as many sats as I possibly can. And for people in El Salvador, I think it will mean new opportunities in terms of tourists, in terms of businesses and investment into the country that will come because, let's say, the Bitcoin bonds as an example, there'll be a lot of people who want to buy those bonds and get exposure to Bitcoin. And yes, it's not the same thing as holding Bitcoin itself, but it might make sense for, say, certain institutions out there who have capital and they can't exactly deploy it directly into Bitcoin, but maybe they can deploy it into a bond. And so maybe this is one way that they can receive some exposure to Bitcoin while being invested. And then maybe from an investor point of view, like a retail or an individual investor point of view, they might be thinking, well, I might be interested in getting a residency or a citizenship right in El Salvador for this. So they might be looking at it from that point of view. And the whole Bitcoin City announcement, I think, is very interesting because 0% income tax, 0 payroll tax, no capital gains tax. I mean, it's going to be pretty ambitious, but if that really did work out and it became the new Singapore or the new Hong Kong of Latin America, that could also be a very powerful idea. I'm hopeful to see lots of these kinds of Bitcoin City or similar projects, but this is the first big one at this kind of scale. So I'm certainly interested to see what happens there also. But I think it's also fair to recognize there's a big journey here. There's a lot of education that has to happen. There's a lot of infrastructure that has to get built out. So for example, you might be trying to pay with Bitcoin and your connectivity is not great. So you might need to, do something with that. And so it will take time, but it's all just part of that journey. And I think this is just what's necessitated by Bitcoin being the harder money. Everyone wants it. People want to adopt it. It's just that certain parts and certain people of the world understand this before other people do. And they are at a massive advantage for it.
When you bear this out, I think what one could fathom happening is like the entire country getting wealthier. At the ground level, there could be more jobs. There could be better jobs. There could be savings in Bitcoin nonetheless, but savings. Whereas maybe throughout a lot of the Western world, like we're seeing today, a lack of savings. Now, when you do a thought experiment, imagine where like this could lead El Salvador, what do you think the possibilities are?
I could see this as there being an initial big momentum up and down. Like, I don't know if we see another like late 2013 and late 2017 sort of pattern play out. Now, to be clear, I don't think we've hit that euphoria yet. I think it's coming maybe next year, early or mid next year. But I think after we sort of wipe out from that, and then have another relative doldrums compared to, the bull market craziness, then that's where people who got wrecked stop and actually learn. They actually go and read the Bitcoin Standard, or they actually listen to my podcast and learn a bit more about actually what is Bitcoin, what is the philosophy, the economics, the technology of Bitcoin. And you create a whole new base of people. And these are all, and many of them might come and work in Bitcoin companies or create Bitcoin content or help teach their own family and friends, hey, you need to get some of this, you need to hold it and save it and think of it as long-term savings. And so I see it as reflecting as big opportunities for the people of El Salvador. When I was there, I went there recently for Adopting Bitcoin and for La BitConf. And so I was a speaker at those, and just having a chance to interact with people and see it used day to day was incredible, especially down in El Zonte and certain parts of San Salvador, the main city of El Salvador. And so I thought that was really cool to see. But certainly there was a long way to go in terms of the general understanding for amongst the general population, right? Obviously, the Bitcoin people were any of them who were into Bitcoin, they all got it straight away, right? But it will take time for that knowledge to filter out to everybody in the country. But I'm optimistic about it.
Tell us more about what El Salvador was like.
Yeah, so I mean, it was really cool the way they essentially laid out the red carpet for Bitcoin people. They changed some of the rules to make it easier for them to come into the country. And then I think soon after, they even took away the PCR test and vaccine requirements for people coming into El Salvador. So they are, I think, you always want to be balanced with these things, because again, you never know how far you can trust a politician, right? They could just be saying something and then actually using it to, let's say, grift the gringos, let's say, as an example. But at the same time, you can also say, look, the incentive is there. He has an incentive because he wants Bitcoin people to come in and put some capital into the country and put their employment, their time and effort into the country, because he sees it like, look, this could be a mutually beneficial thing. Bitcoin people will come here, you get zero tax, you get, a good environment to perhaps set up your business or even work from Bitcoin City, let's say, as an example. And he gets investment, he gets to look like a real visionary, a real leader, and a chance to, I think in his mind, he sees it like he wants to make El Salvador like the Singapore of Latin America. Like, I think that's essentially what is in his mind. He's thinking, let's try to make this like a financial hub for the new Bitcoin world. That's the impression I was getting. Now, a lot of my time was kind of around the conferences and at El Zonte. So that's my experience of it. But essentially, when you were walking around, you go to McDonald's, and essentially McDonald's had their screen that you could purchase, and you literally pull out your Lightning wallet and pay right there. And I believe that is done by OpenNode in the background. So it's very reliable in terms of Lightning payment, go through, all good. And yeah, just from chatting to builders in the space, I just thought it was really cool. Also, actually, one other thing that was an interesting one is the Chivo Atms. So Chivo is like their brand, right? Chivo is the phone wallet, but it's also the ATM network. So you can go to those ATM networks and you can essentially flip out of Bitcoin into US dollar if you need it. And I think you can go the other way as well, but I just tested out just $100 just to see it, right? Just to test it. And so it was actually really slick. The ATM aspect of it was very slick. So I could go to that ATM, punch in, I want to sell $100 of Bitcoin. It gave me a QR. It was an on-chain payment. And then I basically straight away, it put cash into that ATM, and I was able to get some USD out. So that was actually very slick. And I think it could be that the Chivo company behind Chivo might have had more of a capability around ATMs than necessarily being a Lightning hardcore technical company. They might have had more competence and more skill and experience in the ATM business. So that might be why the ATM experience was a bit more slick, let's say, than say, but it is regularly improving as well. So even in the time, like even over the course of a few weeks, they had been iterating the app and improving that also. So I thought that part was really cool. Certain parts, obviously, it is a poorer country, so the infrastructure is not necessarily easy yet. But that said, that didn't stop the Bitcoiners from having a good time. There was a bunch of us down at El Zonte, and they organized trips from San Salvador down to El Zonte as the Bitcoiners, and we would be buying drinks and food at the bar or at the beach bar in El Zonte as an example. So I overall, I guess summing up, I thought it was a really cool experience. I definitely need to learn. I need to learn some Spanish though, but definitely it was a great experience.
How are the people of El Salvador greeting these gringo-like Bitcoiners?
Yeah, so I would say for the most part, everyone, they were all really nice, right? Like I think it was seen like the Bitcoin people were like the tourists, and they wanted to be nice to the tourists because obviously that's part of business for the country. And so I think that was the attitude that I saw. All the Salvadoran people I met were very nice, really easy to talk to. Obviously, the ones who could speak English, because for me, I don't know Spanish. I do need to learn it though. But I had a great experience overall. I think people really, they really sort of pulled out the stops to make people feel welcome, make the Bitcoin people feel welcome. And I'm hopeful that it might become I think it seems to me like it's going to become like a Bitcoiner pilgrimage thing. Like any Bitcoiners around the world will think, hey, you know what, where am I going to go for holiday? Well, let's go to El Salvador. Let's go, and I can, spend some sats and buy food and drink and whatever there. And it's just a really cool experience, well worth doing.
Nayib Bukele's legacy is very much on the line. Mike McGlone came on this show and said, let's just see him as the George Washington of Latin America for the purposes of this conversation, and went into the implications of the decision there to adopt Bitcoin as legal tender. So very clearly that's a high marks, the George Washington of Latin America. Obviously, Nayib Bukele's brand has never been better, especially in the eyes of Westerners. I mean, he's beloved by the Bitcoin industry. And I mean, the uproar with which the announcement was greeted by Bitcoiners at Bitcoin 2021 was, I was kind of not so euphoric in that moment. And it was very interesting watching the whole crowd get up and like cheering in unison. It was a little like, I don't know about this. However, we're watching this play out. And a lot of the stuff you've said, obviously, I think bodes very well for kind of what we've seen and his reputation in particular. So can you speak maybe to Nayib Bukele, the president of El Salvador's reputation and even legacy?
So I think there are Bitcoin people out there with a mixed opinion. So I did an episode with Alex Gladstein sooner around the time of the Bitcoin law. And for example, his view is not as positive, right? He was saying his view is more like, look, he's a dictator in certain ways. That was, or he has certain dictatorial tendencies. Whereas, let's say, the Gladsteins of the world might view him more as being anti-democratic, as an example. Now, I think I'm probably a bit more positive on Bukele myself. I think I'm probably more in a cautiously optimistic category. I think he potentially has an aligned incentive with a lot of Bitcoin people. Doesn't necessarily mean, I mean, of course, he is a politician, so you've always got to remember that they always are out for their own interest. But at the end of the day, you have to think about what are your alternatives. And if he's offering you this ability, so let's say with the new Bitcoin City announcement, that you can go there and have zero tax, well, that's an incredible incentive. So, and there are critics of Bukele from like locally and even internationally, right? So there are other people internationally who are saying, oh, look, see, he's a Democrat, but he's or anti-democratic. He's taking away some of the, how would I say it? Some of the controls in the nation. Now, the pro-Bukele people would say, no, actually, what he's doing is taking away some of the corruption, because some of these people were corrupt, or he's trying to take away some of those elements to try to clean up the country. And so I think it sort of depends who you believe on that point, whether you think, yeah, he's really genuinely cleaning up the country. And of course, he's got to do certain things to get rid of some of the corruption. And that pro view might be more, democracy is not necessarily a good thing, right? Now, I agree that democracy is not necessarily a good thing. What matters is more just respect for private property rights. What matters more is people's individual liberties. And so from my point of view, I see it more like it's not that every dictator is going to be better than a Democrat, but it's just more like they might have more of an incentive to care about the long term, right? This is like an argument from Huntsman and Hopper in Democracy, the God That Failed, right? So there's a little bit of that there. I think it will, and anyway, all those comments aside, I still think this will be a big landmark, right? This will definitely go down in the history books as, hey, this was one of the leaders of a country willing to go to that level. So I think that's impressive.
It's a region which has been dominated, especially in the post-World War II era, by Anglo-American interests, particularly Washington, D.C. It's been referred to historically as the U.S.'s backyard. I believe Rockefeller referred to Latin America as the U.S.'s backyard. The amount of covert operations that have gone on throughout the region is well documented and well known to anybody who studied a little bit of history. And I think this was even probably, you might have got a little taste of this in high school history if you had a good teacher. So now we see Bukele obviously being critiqued by the International Monetary Fund, which has largely historically been driven by US taxpayers or funded by US taxpayers, and also is known for giving out loans in exchange for taking away, in some cases, people's individual liberties through austerity measures or economic medicine, or by propping up plutocrats and individual nations who oftentimes siphon a lot of the funds off for their cronies. Now, the main critique, there are a few critiques, but what really pops out, kind of the pop critique of Nayib Bukele, of course, would be, I would be hypocritical to say on one hand, the IMF is critiquing him, but on the other hand, the World Health Organization, which is essentially a spoke of one more of these international intergovernmental organizations, is applauding him for his pandemic measures. And I think he was one of the strictest leaders during the COVID-19 pandemic. And that is, I think, the vast majority of Bitcoiners, and he's probably well aware of that, aren't large fans of those types of measures. But I think it is also in our interest, like an enemy of your enemy is your friend, I think is like a saying. And for that reason, like it would behoove Bitcoiners to look at this shrewdly and say, these are policies and measures that we support. And it would be in our interest then to, vote with our feet, vacation in El Salvador, which would be voting with our money, whether that be expatriating there or just visiting there or setting up a business there, rewarding these policies and using it as a safe harbor, if you will, or rather a alternative to policies that are being implemented in most of the rest of the world, whilst still remaining skeptical and also strictly rational about these decisions. This is at the end of the day business, right? And you can't get too emotional about business, which is why I was a little suspicious of like the euphoria in the room at Bitcoin 2021. That drove me away from El Salvador at that point. I was like, I don't know about this. Like something about 10,000 people screaming in unison makes me feel like I should probably watch this evolve. His Peter McCormick interview, which was 1 hour long, certainly opened me up to him. I think it was a transparent interview. I think that it also seemed like it was not a controlled interview or contrived in any way. But I think the main point here is that this is a strictly rational based pursuit or opportunity, and that we shouldn't let our emotions get in the way of that. But for now, he's George Washington of Latin America. So Bitcoin bond, what the heck is a Bitcoin bond?
So essentially there is a bit of a structure going that allows people to invest using USDT or Bitcoin, obviously, and they will receive, I don't recall all the details, but I think it's 6.5% coupon. And they will also receive some upside of Bitcoin, some of the Bitcoin upside on the bond also. And I believe it's a 10-year structure. So it's one of those things where you might think, I want to invest in this Bitcoin City idea, or potentially you want to get residency or citizenship. So you might think, okay, I'm going to do that investment and then receive some payouts. And of course, it won't be the same as if you had simply held Bitcoin, but you're getting these other aspects of it. So maybe that's one way to think about it. Or potentially you're an institutional investor where you might not have any other good option. Excuse me. You might be otherwise looking at bonds that are paying negative real returns, and instead thinking, well, hey, I can get this and actually get some Bitcoin return as well and still have some Bitcoin upside on this. Well, maybe that's a better way to do it. So that's my high level thought around the Bitcoin bond.
As we move into 2022, what do you think Bitcoiners need to be keeping an eye towards?
So I think it's around keeping Bitcoin, like the values of Bitcoin, right? So this idea of self-custody, learning how to run your own Bitcoin node, and really keeping those values strong so that people don't compromise the network. But I think that's part of it. But then also part of it is also looking at ways to increase our own freedom, whether that is this whole stacking flags idea, or whether it is something like trying to hunker down and build the citadels or build the mesh citadels. I think those are some ideas that Bitcoin people are looking at. And then, of course, I think we've got a lot of good educational material out there now. So I think people will just continue churning some of that material out to essentially help guide the new coiners in, pre-coiners and new coiners into Bitcoin. I see it also as essentially it's one of the key technologies for people who care about freedom. So I think that's probably an important aspect for people to think about. It's this plus other technologies and maybe ideas, the spread of certain ideas that are important. So it's about spreading certain values out there about what your rights are and what they, how you should be treated by governments around the world, or by companies and companies and governments around the world.
Yeah, so freedom, that's a popular, I think, topic these days. So I guess that's why I entered into the Bitcoin industry. I was originally in gold and silver. I was particularly attracted to silver. I still am. I think holding these things is pretty neat. However, here we are, and we've seen what has happened with Bitcoin in particular, either as digital gold or electronic cash. Now, certainly this is, I guess, when we talk about deflationary growth, or we talk about kind of hyper Bitcoinization, ultimately it is about freedom and liberty and individual rights. Can you kind of speak more to the state of those things in the context of Bitcoin as we head into 2022?
So being honest, the view from 2020 and 2021 hasn't been great for liberty and human rights. I mean, many people are locked in inside their own homes or inside their own country, unable to leave, unable to do the things that they had previously taken for granted, being able to go out and see their friends, or go to dinner, or go to just do normal social things to see their family. And so, unfortunately, that has not been a positive aspect. But Bitcoin has done extremely well over the last few years. So that's perhaps some semblance of hope there. And I think some aspects of the world are going to get worse before they get better. Like, I think that's just the sad reality, is that certain governments and certain aspects of the media, and a lot of people, quite frankly, still believe in the crazy hysteria that is plaguing this world today. The hysteria and the government response is so much more worse than the actual virus. And so they are, in their misguided attempts to stop anyone dying of COVID, they're causing all these additional destructions to people's rights, liberties, health, all sorts of things. And so that part is not very positive, but I am fundamentally bullish longer term. I am fundamentally bullish that over time there will be competition between states, and so there will be some states that are relatively less hysterical and some areas that are less hysterical, and people who cherish freedom can go to those places and they can start investing in those places instead. And potentially we're talking about El Salvador. President Bukele said recently as well that essentially they were taking away the mask mandate, no vax mandate, no test to get in. So that's promising. I mean, if that stays, then potentially that becomes an area where it's a mutual benefit, right? So there might be some Bitcoin people who say, yeah, I really cherish freedom and I want to be able to receive and spend Bitcoin, no issues with capital gains and so on. And probably more for the non-US ones, like US Bitcoiners, it might be a bit more of a difficult conversation just because of still having to pay back to Uncle Sam. But non-US Bitcoiners might get a really big benefit out of that. So that's an example there. And I think we will see other elements or other places that develop further in this area. And otherwise, I think it's just people are stacking away until hyper Bitcoinization.
Some people have like an infinitesimally small view of like what is happening. So they're debating essentially the news cycle. The 24-hour news cycle has them debating topic after topic, and there is like rudimentary data that I think cannot be deciphered in the fog of war. It's like being the paratroopers, I suppose, like when the Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy, and then you're like a paratrooper who like falls, you like land kind of inland a little bit from the beaches, and then debating how the war's going. You have no idea how the war is going. What you can do is maybe take a step back and start discussing the long-term trends that maybe led to the war, that have essentially created human society over centuries. So when you talk about how there's people that are like locked in their home, the proper view is like, okay, how do we get to pre-Magna Carta in like a day? We went from like post-Magna Carta to pre-Magna Carta. That's a far more, I think, a satisfying intellectual discussion. And it's also a far more reason and fact-based one, because with so much data out there today, you can't really draw conclusions about what is in the news right now. I think if you're viewing it from too small of a lens. But of course, if you want to take a look at it in the context of human history, I think you can make some far more defensible like assertions about what's happening and what the implications are. I do share your view long term, though. I think that things are going to be very rosy in the end, as long as we can remain not go extinct, essentially, right? It's like in business, some people say they're like, the only thing that matters is not to run out of money. I guess perhaps you could say like, hey, as long as we're not going extinct, I think the long-term trends are still good. And Bitcoin's a large part of that today. Any closing comments, Stefan?
So yeah, look, I think it does just come down to having that fundamental long-term thesis. And I think to the points you were just making as well, it reminds me of in The Sovereign Individual, where they were saying essentially people didn't realize Rome had already fallen until later, decades later, even hundreds of years later. So it's going to be similar to that. I think people are going to look back on this time, this era of the Hysteria 19 era, and realize that this was the time that many institutions jumped the shark, that people had lost trust in many government institutions that they previously did trust quite a lot, and even media as well. They used to trust the media a lot more. Whereas if you look at the stats now, a lot less people trust media. And so it's interesting how they've done that and still been able to control the minds of so many people effectively by making them so scared to be able to even walk outside their own home without wearing a mask and things like that. So it will change. And I think the places that do support freedom will do better for it. And then people will go to those areas. And then all the people back in the panicker areas will look at the freedom zones and think, hey, I want to live like they're living. So I think it is a matter of time, but it will require perseverance, and it will require resourcefulness, ingenuity. And a big part of that starts with having the discipline to stack sats, having the discipline to keep your expenses low and stack now, because in 10 years time, it won't be so easy to accumulate this many sats for that many bucks, let's say.
That's one of the nice things about the States is the competition here in the US between the different states. And I think we've seen that play out a lot, and we're seeing it actually intensify this kind of states' rights issues and the different cultures of each state. You know, it's funny, you can like in Alaska, there's a show like Alaska State Troopers, and people get pulled over with like handguns under their seats and like an ounce of marijuana, and they just basically get sent on their way. But if that happened to you in California, it'd be a little bit different of interaction. And I think that kind of describes sort of the diversity of what's going on in the United States and the competition it creates. So we've had the honor and privilege, I've held him a little bit longer than I anticipated, of speaking today with Stefan Livera. He is a Bitcoin podcaster, one of the leading Bitcoin podcasters. He's also the managing director of Swan Bitcoin International. Thank you so much, Stefan, for joining us today.
Thanks, Justin. Thanks for having me.
And thank you everyone for listening.